Hi, we're going to talk today about design thinking and how we use that to redesign the future of mental health care. My name is Andrew Chaco. For the past few decades, I've studied leadership, design and innovation, and healthcare. And I've put those lessons together in a company that I recently started, ChacoMD.com. Well, ChacoMD.com is the website, obviously. And for those of you that were at my lecture, you know this disclosure that I have to make. And for those of you that found me through my website, you know that these are the three services that I'm offering. But the real intention behind this is that what I'd like to do is take these lessons that I've synthesized and make them available to people so that you can start to innovate in this very difficult space and very needed space for innovation. So why innovate? Well, Darwin said, "It's not the strongest species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but the ones most responsive to change." And building on that, Anthony Robbins said, "Change is inevitable. Progress, however, is optional." So what exactly is innovation? It seems a pretty scary word that's fraught with technology and apps and interoperability for those of you in healthcare, especially if you're sitting on the outside of innovation circles. It can be quite daunting. But let's take some of the sting out of it. It's really simple. Innovation is simply a new and better way to solve a problem. That's it. Just a new and better way to solve a problem. So why innovate? Well, let's take a look at some companies that didn't. I'm sure you're all familiar with this company. In 1999, Blockbuster was worth $4.8 billion. And actually the year before, they were worth $5.1 billion. So they're doing pretty well. They were at the top of their game. A year later, a little-known company headed by Reed Hastings named Netflix knocks on their door in their Dallas boardroom and asks for a small sum of $50 million to take care of their online offerings. At that time, he was laughed out of the boardroom for many reasons, but principally because one of the things he was offering was to a no late fee model. And that was something they couldn't wrap their heads around because, as I well know, Blockbuster certainly made a good chunk of their revenue off of late fees. And so something that didn't include late fees or obviated them didn't make sense to them. Well, a short 10 years later, Blockbuster was filing for bankruptcy. And why was that? They failed to see this giant behemoth that became Netflix and the opportunity that it represented. But Blockbuster is not the only one. We can look at the hotel industry. Companies like Marriott have been around for 58 years and they're worth $21 billion. Well, here comes an 8-year-old company that we're all familiar with, Airbnb, and in that short time span has become worth $30 billion. And they don't own a single hotel room. And here, I'm sure you all know exactly where this is going. Taxi cab companies are getting their lunch handed to them by a giant that they fail to recognize as well. And in many ways, the taxi cab companies can be likened to us because, as physicians, because they have government endorsement through their gold medallions that that allow them to offer a service and deliver people and ferry people around. Well, let's think a little bit about business. Business has two functions, marketing and innovation. This is quoting Pete Drucker. He's a business guru. Medicine is a $3.1 trillion industry. That's 3.1 trillion reasons somebody wants a part of that pie. What about physicians? Aren't we protected? Aren't we immune? Like, for whatever reason, we probably feel like we are because the government has endorsed our ability to dispense medications, and if patients want medications or different kinds of treatment, certainly surgery, they need to come through us. And that sort of feeling was probably a similar sentiment to what the taxi cab drivers were feeling prior to Uber coming along. And I'm not saying it's going to be quite that easy, but they were feeling pretty protected as well. Well, I could focus on any group in healthcare. It's easy to pick anyone. I'm going to pick psychiatry, one, because I'm a psychiatrist, and so I can focus on that quite easily. And the talk that I originally gave was to a group of psychiatrists, and so they could feel this or resonate with this much more easily. So who's out to eat our lunch as a psychiatrist? Well, there are certainly companies. I just came back from a conference, or two conferences, where I was talking to different companies that are looking at all kinds of different ways to create apps or utilize AI in the mental health space. And one company in particular, although there were a few that were doing this, one company in particular was exciting or interesting because what they were doing was offering mental health care services in a non-traditional realm. They were looking to do that quality of life measurement, the emotional state measurement for who? For orthopedists, for cardiologists, in unserved markets. And so they were going to keep track of what's the emotional state of the patients. What is the spiritual state of the patients? How are they responding to their medications? How do they feel about their care? All in order to create better patient engagement. But it's a quick hop, skip, and a jump into like much more traditional mental health care. And not that we should feel threatened by it. It's important to be aware of those companies and what's going on. There are other companies doing behavioral health apps, certainly mindfulness, yoga, whatever else in that space. And then there's patients. I live and work in San Francisco. I have a private practice there in addition to my full-time job as a VA psychiatrist. And in that city, more than 50% of the psychiatrists charge fee for service. That means the patients pay out of pocket to come see them. And some people charge up to $500 an hour. Well, while that might be great for Mark Zuckerberg and a bunch of other tech billionaires or even millionaires, for many of the people in the city, that is a little bit out of their price range, if not a lot of bit out of their price range. And so they need to start looking elsewhere. They need to find other options. So it's that inability to access. And even for those that can access and can afford it, there's a dearth of providers that they can actually see, let alone ones that are a good fit. And then even within medicine, we have people that are, quote unquote, eating our lunch. There are different groups that are trying to get prescribing or have gotten prescribing authority. And actually, if we take a step back and look at the course of psychiatry and psychiatric treatment, for a long time, this has been the purview of the physician, of the psychiatrist. And when the discipline of psychology came up, that therapy that was once the reign of psychiatrists became something that was quickly in their purview. And to join their ranks were marriage and family therapists and social workers. And certainly in California, there's a whole host of different types of psychotherapists or therapists that can offer their services. So this is just to show you how the landscape continues to change, and that change is a constant, and we have to be kind of aware of it. In many ways, I feel like we are the blockbuster in the boardroom. And these companies and these other groups that are looking for different ways are knocking on our door and asking for a seat. They are the Netflix saying, let's have a seat. Let's figure this out together. And pretty soon, if we don't heed that warning, we will find ourselves on the outside. And in much the same way that Blockbuster did. Again, this is not to be an alarmist. It's just to be kind of cognizant of what's going on. So now that we've talked about why we should innovate, let's think about why or how do we innovate? Well, oftentimes innovation happens on accident, right? Mold grows over the petri dish and we figure out, oh, hey, here's penicillin. or, we inadvertently, in the process of trying to find different ways to, different efficacies of poison, we come up with chemotherapy, which is an interesting story. So how do we take the randomness and the chance out of it? How do we maximize our chances of being able to innovate? Design thinking is just that. It's a process for innovation. And one way to think about it is one of three legs of a stool that supports a market or products or services. And it's not the DBT that most behavioral health professionals are thinking about. It is, in fact, design, business, and technology. Now, business examples we're all quite familiar with. It is just that it's a simple business idea that grows into a company. Something like Starbucks. And why I would pick Starbucks is they didn't invent coffee. They didn't invent the coffee shop. They didn't even invent, coffee mugs or whatever else they're selling. But what they found was an opportunity to combine different elements and create an offering that people would resonate with. Technology, on the other hand, is a whole different idea. It's when we invent a new technology and then all of a sudden a business grows out of that. Google is a great example of that, where when they invented a new way to search, that invented a whole new business, or that came out, that created the space for a whole new business. In medicine, we can look at MRI. When that technology was created, all of a sudden there's a whole new business around that. Or the technology of TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, also has created a whole new area for business and business development. Well, then there's design. And design, unlike the other two, is focused on the problem. We develop solutions based on a thorough understanding of the problem. Well, this is kind of what we do as clinicians, right? When patients come into our office, we don't look at them and try to offer them a given business solution. And we don't look at them and try to offer them a given technology. What we do, every patient that comes in, I'm not trying to give them the same pill that the previous patients. What I do is look at them, figure out what problem they're having, and then try to craft a solution around that. So if we're already doing this as physicians, if we're already creating solutions, why should we actually learn anything about design thinking? We're already doing it, right? Well, sort of. When we expand our abilities in this problem-solving arena, we're able to then offer more and different solutions, maybe even solutions that have never come up before, that may better meet our patients' needs. On top of that, we can find ways to streamline our practice, improve our personal lives even. My mentor at Stanford actually recently published a book on using design thinking for designing your life, the life that you want to live. And then finally, for those of you that get bitten by the bug, like I have, we can use these same principles to redesign mental health care in general. But let's take a step back for a second and look at a case study. Now, in 2007, a team of 5 students got together at the D School for a class on solving some of the world's bigger problems. And they chose, how do we prevent the deaths of infants that are born prematurely? Every year, 20 million infants are born prematurely. 1 million will die within 24 hours. 4 million die within the first 4 weeks. The leading cause of that is hypothermia. And the cost of incubators is $20,000. And even if a baby survives, they'll often be facing lifelong problems, health problems. So they thought quite reasonably that the problem really is that incubators are way too expensive, and they set about making cheaper incubators. Well, fortunately, one of the members of that group, Linus, had a trip to Nepal. And came upon a curious finding. He found there were plenty of unused donated incubators. And that didn't make sense, because how are these incubators being unused and babies are still dying? So when he asked the physician about that, he said, well, the babies aren't dying here. They're dying in the villages. And all of a sudden, there was quite an aha moment. They faced a new problem. And they faced a new user. The user wasn't the doctor. It was the new mother that was living in the village, that didn't have access to clinicians, that didn't have reliable electricity, and actually most likely distrusted medicine. So if a physician said, take 2 teaspoons of that, of whatever medicine, they would often take 1. And if they were told to heat the baby or keep the baby warm to 37 degrees, they would probably keep it warm to 30 degrees in order to make sure it was safe and tone down this very strong Western medicine. So how do they compensate for all these things? So they went back to the drawing board and they came up with their new need. The need wasn't a cheaper incubator. The need was actually to keep the baby warm. And then they came up with a solution, which is the Embrace Infant Warmer. And basically, it's a pouch that wraps around the baby with a special heating element that boils, that gets heated and absorbs the energy in boiling water. So it doesn't require electricity, and then can maintain the right temperature for up to 5 hours. So now all of a sudden they devised a solution that was able to keep the baby warm at the right temperature in a way that the mother could actually interact with the baby. And if you think about the fact that at this point in a fetus's life, they would still be integrally tied to the mother. Continuing to have that contact with the mother is not only good for the mother and the bonding with the baby, but also great for the baby. And I would argue that it's even a better solution than the incubators we have that kind of keeps that distance or forces that distance. Well, the team left Stanford and turned down many paths that they could have gone, ended up forming that into a business. And in the process of winning many awards, they've also saved thousands and thousands of lives. So, the process of design. The first step is to truly understand the problem. Einstein said, if I had 20 days to solve a problem, I would spend 19 days defining it. And that's how important it is actually to understand a problem. As behavioral health professionals, we already know, like many tricks in ethnographic research, how to really understand the patient or the client that's sitting in front of us and understand all the different dimensions. And that's what's part of the biopsychosocial model. So let's look at a problem, the problem of medications. And what is the problem of medications? It's compliance. Let's look specifically at antidepressants. What need do they solve? Well, we'll look at antidepressants. We could look at any medication. We'll look at that because, like I said, most of us are psychiatrists. Well, is it to cure depression? If so, why are we trying to cure depression? I would actually argue we're not trying to cure depression. What we're trying to do is improve a patient's quality of life. And in order to do that, we actually need to understand what defines their quality of life. And in the process of doing that, we can understand what the reasons they have for taking their medication and what some of the obstacles are that keep them from taking their medication. And then we can start crafting solutions around that quality of life and some of those constraints. Well, that's going to serve 2 purposes. We're going to see increased patient buy-in because we're creating a plan. We're helping create a plan around what they want. And certainly, while I would argue that almost every clinician I know really cares oftentimes that care isn't seen on the part of the patients. And doing it this way, the patient feels that concern, feels that care. And both of those are going to go towards increasing compliance, which is something we all want. And then if we think about the fact that the modal number of visits to a therapist's office is usually 1, meaning more than 50% of the people only go once to a therapist's office, getting them to come back in to even tweak the solution or to continue to treat them is hugely important. And this is going to increase their likelihood of return. And I would say added up, it's going to improve your clinical effectiveness. And for those of you trying to keep your practices open, this will certainly have effect on your bottom line. So the second set is to define the need. Well, what do I mean by that? When we look at the need in context, we can look at the refrigerator. What need does it meet? Is it about keeping food cold or displaying magnets? I would actually argue that the real need it serves is preserved food. We found out many 100 years ago that if we keep food cold, it stays longer. But if what we're trying to do is preserve food, then we start looking at who we're preserving food for. The need to preserve food can actually manifest as very different solutions. One for the backcountry backpacker is going to be very different than a Tibetan monk or even different types of restaurants, right? So once we've understood the problem and defined the need, we can start to figure out, based on that need, what the issues are. So going back to the person that has a problem with medication compliance and isn't able to take their medications or can't take their medications or doesn't take their medication, we can look at what if the problem really is that they can't get to the pharmacy, and they can't get to the pharmacy because they're working during pharmacy hours or because they don't have a license or they don't have a car or don't have access to a ride. Well, their situation is going to be very different than the person that just simply doesn't have enough money and can't afford the medication. And therefore, their solutions are going to be quite different. So then we can look at exploring solutions. Well, in this part, we look at the early phase. The early phase of exploring solutions is the early ideation phase, where we come up with tons of ideas, all kinds of ideas, and many of the ideas are just going to go nowhere, but it's important to just generate lots of ideas. And then we're going to pick a few and start making them and seeing what we can glean from making them. And then as we make and learn, we can continue to refine the idea until we hone in on a solution. So looking back at the issue of medication compliance, if, for example, one of the problems, and this is documented and known, that oftentimes people don't take their medications because they associate it with being sick, and people don't want to feel sick. Well, what if we turn that association around and connected it with feeling well? Or what are they taking their medications for? Are they taking it so they can see their granddaughter graduate? Are they taking it so they can finally take that trip to Africa to see the pyramids? Well, let's reassociate the medications with the reasons they have for living, and maybe we'll see a change in our compliance. Going back to the patient that can't get a ride to the pharmacy, maybe what it is we hire that taxi cab company that's going out of business, and that's the best solution, getting them to the pharmacy. Or we can find a way for them to connect with the pharmacy and maybe have the medication delivered or mailed. And that active problem solving will help greatly. And for the patient with the money problem, it could be as simple as getting them more money or finding a cheaper alternative. Then in the fourth step, we express the solution. And express, all that means, it's design speak for making something. And why do we make something? We make it because we learned something in the process of making. And we do that by prototyping. And there's many different types of prototypes. So in the fifth phase, we test the solution. And then we get the feedback from having tested the solution. We look at what worked and we build on that success. We look at what didn't and we learn from those failures. I had a patient who came to me because of a medication compliance issue. He came to my pharmacotherapy of addictions clinic because his primary care doc thought that he had an addiction issue and he was taking his meds too often and running out and having to go to the ER. And talking to the patient, found that it seemed much more like actually his pain was inadequately treated. But part of that meant recalibrating his pain scale and what a 0 pain meant and a 10 out of 10 meant. And oftentimes patients feel unheard when they come into the office, and they will, very flatly say, "Doc, my pain is an 11 out of 10 or 12 out of 10. And the first thing I do is assure them that I trust that you're in pain. There's not a part of me that doubts that you are in pain. But let's think about what a 10 out of 10 is. 10 out of 10 is so severe, you'd probably be passed out. You certainly couldn't be talking. A 9 out of 10, it would be hard to stay conscious, let alone sitting. Someone sawing through your leg with a rusty blade, slowly, with no anesthesia, obviously. A 3 out of 10 is really uncomfortable and probably hard to go to sleep with a 3 out of 10. And a 5 out of 10, I might be tearing up. It would be very, very painful. So, given that new perspective, and he recalibrated his pain scale, said, I can certainly get you to a 0, but you might be in a coma in the process, and that really isn't a great quality of life. So what's a reasonable amount of pain, and what is pain keeping you from doing? And as we talked about, it turned out that his big issue and the thing he wanted to do was take road trips. And so when we start building a solution around that, we looked at maybe you can't take road trips the way you did when you were 18. He was now considerably older than 18. Maybe what you have to do is stop every 2 hours and take a little bit of a break and give your back a little bit of a break. And then you come back to the office and we'll see. If 2 hours was not good and you still suffered, maybe what we need to do is scale it back to 1 hour. And maybe we can even tweak the length of the break. Could it be 30 minutes? Could it be 15 minutes? What's going to be good? And if 2 hours is good, well, why settle there? Maybe we could try 3 hours. Maybe we could start off with longer breaks and then get shorter and shorter. It's important to recognize that design and innovation are not about being revolutionary. They certainly can be. You can certainly come up with some amazing, beautiful things that haven't been come up with before. But it really, at the end of the day, is about being effective. So then we get to the final stage, which is the express test cycle. That means simply going back, making something, trying out a solution, and then testing it out, taking that feedback into the next solution and keep kind of iterating. And at some point, you might figure out what we need is actually go back to phase 1 and get more understanding of the problem. So you can go back to any phase or any part and keep going round and round. And as you continue to refine the solution that you've come up with. So who else is facing this issue? This is important to recognize. I would argue every other clinician is facing this issue of medication compliance. Well, can they be our customer? Can we help other clinicians be more effective? Would they not like that? How can we improve their clinical effectiveness? So if we start looking at it this way, instead of thinking about how quickly our pies get eaten and how little there is of it, we can actually realize there's a much bigger pie or many different kinds of pie. And then we can actually have our pick of any of them.